I didn't want to make a video about child sex trafficking conspiracy theories, but hey, it's 2020, folks. None of us get what we want this year. So, for reasons that I'm not going to go into in depth in this video, basically, I've worked in the counter trafficking field since 2007. I feel a bit responsible for some of the talking points circulating in support of the notion that child sex trafficking is the real pandemic. I've actually worked with a lot of the most commonly cited data about human trafficking and its prevalence. For a more general discussion of human trafficking, I made a previous video about trafficking in the Disney animated canon. I'll link to that below if you want to check it out. In this video, I want to explain both why these child sex trafficking conspiracy theories are wrong, and more importantly, why they're harmful. A few caveats and disclaimers up front. I'm not going to go into QAnon generally in terms of what it is, how it came to be, its ontological or epistemological foundations, or anything like that. If you're interested in a broader analysis of QAnon, I highly recommend checking out Dan Olson's Folding Ideas video, In Search of a Flat Earth. I'll link to that in the description below as well. I'm also not targeting this video at QAnon truthers, or more generally, child sex trafficking conspiracy theory true believers. I'm not sure there's any reaching those people, honestly. Rather, my aim here is to provide some important context and analysis for people who hear these stories, know that they oppose abuse of children, and therefore may give some credence to these, or even inadvertently spread them because they want to do the right thing in protecting children. So first, let's talk about child sex trafficking, child sexual exploitation, conspiracy theories, and how to spot them. While the subject matter makes these theories more grim to consider, we can look at critical thinking around conspiracy theories in general to help ground us. I'll link to a number of resources in the description, but for now, let's review a 10-point list from Scientific America. One proof of the conspiracy supposedly emerges from a pattern of connecting the dots, even if no evidence supports the connections. Two, the agents behind the pattern of the conspiracy would need to have nearly superhuman power to pull it off. Three, the conspiracy is complex. Four, the conspiracy involves a large number of people who would all need to keep silent about their secrets. 5, the conspiracy encompasses a grand ambition for control over the country, the economy, the political system, etc. 6, the conspiracy theory ratchets up from small events that might be true to larger, much less probable events. 7, the conspiracy theory assigns portentous or sinister meanings to innocuous, insignificant events. 8, the theory tends to commingle facts and speculation without distinguishing between them. 9, the theorist is indiscriminately suspicious of all government agencies or all private groups without seeing nuance between them. 10, the conspiracy theorist refuses to consider alternative explanations. All right, with that as a quick foundation, let's look at one example, the idea that e-commerce home goods site Wayfair is actually a front for child trafficking. This story first started making the rounds in mid-July of 2020. According to the fact-checking site Snopes, the idea first appeared on a subreddit on July 9th and then hit Twitter on July 10th. The only evidence, and I hesitate to even call it evidence, was that the pricing algorithm on Wayfair was behaving strangely, with what appeared to be pretty typical cabinets that would normally retail for probably around $100 to $150 being listed for upwards of $10,000. Yeah. Okay, so the reason I'm picking this one is because I was actually asked about it by a few well-meaning people, so it clearly got a lot of traction and had folks who aren't deep in the QAnon rabbit hole concerned. And obviously it would be horrible if it were true. When asked about it, my immediate reaction was no, it's not true. That's not how human trafficking works. Let me elaborate on what I mean by that. Going back to our conspiracy theory detecting list from Scientific America, we can see that we're already failing that first one, proof of the conspiracy supposedly emerging from a pattern of connecting the dots between events that need not be causally connected. When no events support these connections except the allegation of the conspiracy, or when the evidence fits equally well to other connections or just to chance, the conspiracy theory is likely to be false. And also number 7, the conspiracy theory assigns portentous, sinister meanings to what are most likely innocuous or insignificant events. To put it more bluntly and explicitly, there is no reason to leap from high prices to child trafficking. There's just no reason to connect these two ideas. Jumping to the bottom of the list, the conspiracy theorist refuses to consider alternative explanations, rejecting all disconfirming evidence, blatantly seeking out only confirmatory evidence is also in play here. There is a pretty benign explanation here. Dynamic pricing algorithms are wonky, sometimes do dumb things. You can track this on Amazon for yourself if you want to. These sites are constantly repricing items based on supply, demand, your own browsing history, etc. Always check incognito to see if they can sucker you into paying more. Additionally, in the case of a large corporation like Wayfair, with around 12,500 employees and plenty of corporate lawyers, I think it's worth considering point 4. The conspiracy involves a large number of people who would all need to keep silent about their secrets. Why would Wayfair take this kind of risk? Why would all their employees stay silent? Trafficking is usually a profit-driven crime, but would their profit be sufficient to justify the risk? It seems incredibly unlikely to me. Even if we were to assume something nefarious is going on, which again doesn't really make sense, why would that nefarious thing be child trafficking? If I wanted to move contraband and cabinets for profit, surely I'd do drugs. Easier to store and hide, certainly profitable. And even if we were to assume, again without any reason to, that they are trafficking children, that just leaves so many unanswered questions. Where are they getting these children from? If they're kidnapping them, which is very rare in trafficking, that's a pretty conspicuous way to get children, so it's strange that it's managed to stay hidden, and the only reports we have about it are this weird pricing fluke. How does the transportation work? Presumably Wayfair isn't putting kids in cabinets and sending them via FedEx to abusers. Are they doing their own transportation? Why haven't we seen people doing the transportation reporting something? What happens to the kids after? Do they get sent back somehow, or do they just get killed? Also, why would Wayfair advertise this on their website? There are plenty of dark web websites and that sort of thing for selling sex. Dark web forums are a much better place in terms of security and anonymity for any sort of illegal activity. It's not like they're reaching new buyers, since, according to the theory, you would have to be in the know about the secret front of expensive cabinets, so why take that risk? And if I'm a buyer, why would I take that risk? Paying with a credit card or with PayPal? That's just a really easy way to get caught, or even just having my online footprint linked to the site and this activity seems risky. Why would I do it this way? Why wouldn't I go with a less risky, less traceable method? Well, that was exhausting, and I feel a little gross thinking about the right way to engage in child trafficking, but that's what's so insidious about these types of rumors. You have to go through it piece by piece to debunk, and by the time you're done, you're there on to some other pizza parlor or retailer crying sex trafficking. On July 22nd, Polaris, the U.S. non-governmental organization that operates the U.S. National Human Trafficking Hotline, had to put out a press release about all of this because the hotline was so inundated with calls that they couldn't serve actual people in need. As they put it in the press release, all contact with the trafficking hotline is confidential. What we can say is that none of the reports we have received involving Wayfair contained any information beyond what was widely shared online, nor have any of these reports been made by someone who has a specific connection to any alleged missing children. I've heard it argued that essentially none of that really matters, though, since A, child sex trafficking does happen, and B, it's clearly very bad, then C, it doesn't matter if people get the details wrong. Raising awareness and opposing the sex trafficking itself are good, regardless of those details. But I'd want to push back on that argument for a couple of reasons. First, when you ignore how and why sex trafficking really happens, and as a result, who is actually most vulnerable, it becomes incredibly difficult to enact policy changes that actually protect those people or actually prevent abuse. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children reported that in 2019 they assisted law enforcement and families with more than 29,000 cases of missing children. The vast majority, 91% of them, were runaways, with family abduction the next most common, that's 4% of cases, and missing young adults, another 4%. Non-family abductions were the least common, less than 1% of cases. According to NCMEC, while any child can be targeted by a trafficker, research has shown that traffickers often target children with increased vulnerabilities, including children who are chronically missing or who frequently run away, especially if they have more than 3 missing incidents. Children who have experienced childhood sexual abuse, especially if the abuse was unreported or unaddressed, or resulted in the child being removed from the home. Children who have experienced prior sexual assault or rape. Children with significant substance abuse issues or who live with someone who has significant substance abuse issues. And children who identify as LGBTQ and have been kicked out or who have been stigmatized by their families. So knowing all of that changes the kinds of policies and programs that would be effective to help these children and to prevent abuse. If child sex trafficking were truly about protecting children from violent kidnappers breaking into our homes, we would need very different solutions. But as it stands, things like increased resources for children in foster care and group homes, increased funding for shelters for youth experiencing homelessness, services and financial support for children aging out of foster care, support for LGBTQ youth, including making sure parents don't reject queer and trans children, and so on, those should be our focus. Here's Huffington Post senior enterprise reporter Michael Hobbs speaking at the On Media September 18th, 2020 podcast on this.
If we're actually concerned about this problem, the real version of the problem, not the sort of shadowy version of the problem, we need places for kids to sleep. We need safe places for kids to go. Getting rid of the desperation would cut down on this problem far more than any number of trafficking raids, trailers or not.
Also, according to the Polaris-operated National Human Trafficking Hotline, in 2019 the most commonly reported recruitment tactics for sex traffickers was either exploiting an existing romantic relationship or pursuing a romantic relationship as a means to recruit. Second most common was exploiting an existing familial relationship. Kidnapping did not make the top 5 recruitment tactics for sex or labor trafficking in 2019, and the trends hold remarkably steady with what the hotline saw in 2018. Again, when people picture sensationalized versions of sex traffickers kidnapping children off the street, what they are imagining is not how trafficking tends to work, and this has real consequences. From well-meaning legislation that fails to include provisions for prosecuting recruiters that don't fit the kidnapper mold, all the way to vigilante quote-unquote justice that provides a cover for going after innocent people. And as we can see from that vigilante example, you can actually start to enact policies or practices that are harmful, whether because they take resources away from work that would be helpful or because they have unintended consequences that were hard to foresee because you weren't looking at the true nature of the problem. We saw that before with the U.S. helpline for trafficking victims overwhelmed responding to conspiracy theories. Or to take a very different example, Nepal legally bans young women from taking certain jobs in Gulf states, ostensibly to protect them from exploitation. In practice, however, because this policy failed to consider the realities of how and why these young women were vulnerable to abuse in the Gulf states and why they wanted to pursue work there, this policy has actually made women more vulnerable. I'll link to an article with more details in the description. Second, you can undermine the legitimacy of counter-trafficking efforts and make people less likely to believe survivors. Regardless of the source of the conspiracy theory, when you promote falsehoods, you harm the credibility of survivors. People very reasonably will start to doubt stories about child sex trafficking or question the validity of counter-trafficking organizations' claims, making it that much harder to actually address these issues. As Michael Hobbs said in that same podcast,
you can't just throw poison into the public consciousness willy-nilly because what you end up with is QAnon. I mean, this QAnon stuff, it's fascinating to me that, it's only a sort of 20% exaggeration on the kinds of myths that we've been getting about trafficking for 20 years now.
Third, when we are so focused on conspiracy theories, we can inadvertently let powerful actors like corporations or politicians get away with practices or policies that are terrible for children. Even just continuing to pick on Wayfair for a moment here, I'm way more concerned about the potential for forced labor and child labor in their supply chains, and I'd much rather they devote their energies to addressing that. However, we all tend to feel a bit uncomfortable pushing back on that issue since we're all a little bit complicit in that form of child exploitation if we consume most products. There's no ethical consumption in late stage capitalism and all that jazz. Moreover, sometimes those conspiracy theories go one step further and suggest that only a repressive authoritarian leader can protect us and our children. And that is particularly dangerous because it's exactly that sort of power dynamic that allows abuse of vulnerable people, particularly children, to continue. I'll just say it. If your goal is to protect children, then you should absolutely oppose President Donald Trump, whose family separation policies alone should be enough to make it clear how terrible he is for children. By the time you're watching this video, there's a very good chance that some new conspiracy theory from QAnon or about child exploitation will be making the rounds. I hope that this video can serve as a foundation for how to think critically about those claims. Again, I'll link to some resources in the description below, but some of the keys are checking sources and the plurality of expert opinion, watching for random or arbitrary connecting of the dots, considering the logistics of what it would take to pull off the alleged scheme, including how many people would have to stay silent, and the more that would, the less likely something is, and evaluating alternative explanations. At the end of the day, these child sex trafficking conspiracy theories serve an important function. They create an imagined enemy that takes a particular shape, a group of helpless innocents in need of protection from that enemy that takes a particular shape, and then they use that combination to justify certain beliefs and actions that are ultimately harmful. Harmful to people erroneously targeted by policies or vigilante responses, harmful to children who are actually vulnerable or experiencing abuse, and when used to justify authoritarianism, harmful to our ability to build a just, equitable, and safe world.